My name is Lara. I'm the Heritage Engagement Officer here at Edinburgh Printmakers. Welcome everyone. It's really great to see so many of you here and to know that so many more are joining us online for this incredible exhibition. This exhibition is monumental. Every time I walk in or see it, I discover a new character that I hadn't noticed before and a new vignette that then gets stuck in my mind for the rest of the day. So we'll leave our speakers introduce it. I just have a little housekeeping to do before we start. So if the fire alarm goes off, the nearest fire exits are where you came in, the front door, but also that door over there, and then straight left onto the street. But obviously staff will be there to direct you. And yeah, before I'm going to introduce you now, I'm not going to say anything more about the exhibition, apart from the fact that whole of ours is on until the 2nd of November. So you can come back many, many, many times to see it in full and discover, I think, more and more things every time you come. Yes, please join me in welcoming today our speakers, which are Robert Powell, who is first and foremost, I should say, a calming presence in our studio, a thoughtful and supportive Italian technician. But he's also an incredibly talented visual artist whose multidisciplinary practice focuses on printmaking but extends to video and text and sculpture. He is a graduate of Edinburgh College of Art and a long-standing studio member of Edinburgh Printmakers, and Robert has exhibited widely at home as well as throughout Europe, North America, and the Far East. And he is joined today in conversation by Dr. Alasdair Richmond, who I'm very happy to sort of welcome at Edinburgh Printmakers. And Alasdair teaches philosophy at Edinburgh University. He's interested in time, space, and the philosophy of science, and he mainly researches the philosophy of time travel, which I think is very, very cool. He also never got over failing to win the John Menzies Dr. Monster Painting Competition 1976, which personally I would like to know more if there's a bit of time today, but maybe not. And yeah, finally, I would just like to recognise the support of New Media Scotland, Creative Scotland, and National Archive Heritage Fund in the production of this exhibition and the related events. So thank you all for coming, and yeah.
Robert and I agreed that I would go first. So good evening, my name is Alasdair Richmond, my speciality is travel. Yeah. And someone who knows my research interests thought that it would be interesting to get me and Robert talking about time and the nature thereof. And I'm acutely conscious that my talking is actually spoiling one of the most interesting effects that the machine behind me generates, which is a series of graded tickings and talkings made by Robert's relatives. My interest in time started out through the philosophy of science.
I've got to come out and let you sit down. I can see over your shoulder.
I wish you well, sir, whoever you are. I feel you and I share whatever is ailing you.
I think that sounds like my dad.
Oh, it's your dad. Hello, Robert's dad. Hello, Robert's dad.
Hi, Mum. Hi, Dad.
So we got into this because we sort of bonded over a liking of a number of writers and films, and where this got interesting for me was Robert's ideas about how you represent time. Because one of the interesting things in my line of work is trying to reconcile time under its serial aspect, the way that things are laid out earlier than and later than, versus time under its flowing aspect, under its dynamic aspect. And if you will look around you, you will see amongst the intricacies into which you can get lost, and you will get lost. Be prepared, set aside a day to get lost in one picture, come back and get lost in another series of pictures, and you will see little riffs on ways of representing time, from clock parts and the seasons, individual fragments of, pendulums, wheels for propulsion, wheels for telling the time, gears, and representations of days laid out spatially, hence hall of hours. And one of the things that interests me is what physics has to tell us about time. This is something Robert and I spoke about at length. And the interesting thing is that when we perceive time when we interact with our surroundings, one of the first things that strikes us is the present is just that bit more interesting and salient than the other moments in time, I think it's fair to say. Try this at the dentist. Try denying the salience of the present. Try lying there as I do, going, the present is one moment among other moments. It's no more, no less real than any of the rest. This is just one, and believe me, it doesn't work. You can sit there and tell yourself till you're blue in the face, the present is one moment among other moments, and when the drill is actually homing in on the tooth, my goodness, the present is more alive and salient. But big bits of physics seem to be telling us that, in fact, the present just isn't any more salient than any of the other moments. And that just as, we can refer to Australia and Mumbai and Canberra as existing but not here, so we can refer to other moments in time, be it past or future, as existing but not now. That the serial aspect of time, just one sense of it laid out, as if it's distributed spatially, seems to be what's really fundamental. And the flowing stuff, the dynamic stuff, seems to be just something that human beings bring to it, or that consciousness brings to it. And so Robert has taken, I'd like to think Robert has taken some of this and incorporated it into the depiction of moments as things that are visitable. You can have a hall of hours, just as you can have a hall of images and distributions. So something that you might like to take some time doing is to see how many different ways of representing time you can spot, auditory as well as visual, and I think you'll spot references from everything from clock parts and penny farthings through to ancient Egyptian cosmology. I don't propose to say anything too much more just now, Robert. Well,
thank you, Alasdair. Just to say, when I first got in touch with Alasdair and asked if he would like to do a talk here, I was imagining him talking about his ideas and work, and I'm sitting there enjoying it from the front row. So I was a bit shocked when the poster came out, and I read it, and it's in conversation with, so it's more work than I anticipated. So here goes. Yes, so the representation of time has been a bit of a bugbear, I suppose. I've been interested in time for a while because it's pretty much human to be interested in time. We kind of, I suppose it's something that we're all existing within and yet find it very hard to articulate. And it's very hard to articulate it within, an artistic practice, because you do picture, film, a piece of text or music, and you say it's about time, but every other example of those things also exists in time and also is in consequence about time. So back in, it would have been 25th of June 2019 when I met Alasdair for the second time. The first time had been way back in 2014 when he was describing the time traveller's hats he makes to Ali Grant, who's here in the audience, and myself, which was interesting. We decided to work, well, it was suggested that we work together because someone that makes silly hats seems like probably a perfect match for.
I wasn't going to mention the hats actually, but yeah, I also make hats.
I was definitely going to mention the hats.
I made a, sorry to interject, but I made a model time machine and stuck it on a hat. And I used this as a visual aid for my teaching. And I would have brought it along, but I went overboard and it weighs about 8 kilos.
Can I recommend you Google Alasdair's hat? They're a treat. Yes, so back then, we had been put together to work together, and the result was a body of work, an exhibition called The Conference for Chrononauts, and I tried to approach Alasdair's thinking about the things that he's interested in, these like problems and thought experiments that time travel poses, and it was just, you know, it was really difficult to try and actually encapsulate time within like the intrinsic elements of a piece of art. So, you know, I made this exhibition, but I was also still kind of scratching my head how to go about it a bit further. And some other things happened around the same time. That very morning that I met Alasdair, I discovered I was going to become a father. A year or so later, yes, well,
I don't think those two events were in any way connected. Just like to emphasize.
And a couple of years later, my child became very interested in clocks. So he came across the cuckoo clock at my parents' house, and that kind of set him off onto looking at dials and barometers, mantle clocks. To go along the street looking at church clocks, and he would sort of wave his arms like, "There's a clock, there's a big clock over there." I sort of blush and fan myself. And to make him happy, I started drawing lots of clocks. Now, clocks are intrinsically fascinating things themselves. They are kind of intricate and yet streamlined. They have this beauty about them that comes from suggesting something so like, I suppose the kind of conveyance of information has its own particular beauty, and this ineffability of time seems to be encapsulated in these quite precise objects, you know, clocks. And so I started thinking, well, how would making a clock be a different, like how would making a special clock that was about time rather than a clock that simply measured time? So this is, I suppose, not just the thing that's behind us, but everything all around, all kind of feeds in. Simultaneous to that, Mark Daniels from New Media Scotland asked if I could make an animation to go on the 4 feet high LED screen up in Aberdeen Performing Arts. And I had a whole load of different ideas, and I told him those ideas, and then at the end I said, also my kid's really into clocks, I could do a clock, and he was like, that's the one. So I suppose that's what then professionally and kind of seriously set me off making kind of big clock. So Alasdair priming the ideas, Mark making a kind of formal excuse. The animation is there behind you, by the way. It's a kind of animated automata clock where something different happens every 15 minutes. So you need to stay here for the full 12 hours to fully appreciate it. We're going to lock the doors to make sure.
I'm assuming that's Robert being light-hearted. If he isn't, I wasn't in on it. Of course not. Something we talked about, which is a branch of the philosophy of time travel, a small but flourishing branch of the subject. Besides, the obvious problems, like if you can travel to another time, does that mean that the contents of that time are there before you? Do they dictate to you? I mean, suppose you see your future self doing something dreadful. This was something we were talking about just the other day. If you take the idea that moments are just laid out, as we think of pages laid out in a book, time travel would be the ability, to sort of skip ahead, as it were, and come back or visit earlier bits. And suppose you catch your future self doing something reprehensible, murder, let's say, and you think to yourself, well, if that really is my future self, I don't seem to have any say in the matter. I mean, if it really is the future I've seen, then I have no leeway, there's no sort of flexibility. Could you live with knowing the consequences of your hitherto unmade future decisions? This is one of the things that philosophers of time travel worry about. And one of the other things that we worry about is how would you convince people that you were from another time? What would you do? How would you convince somebody that you actually had travelled? Let's say you go back in time and you solve one of the great sort of conjectures from literary history. Was Shakespeare's Hamlet partly based on an earlier play? Thomas Kyd's so-called Ur-Hamlet. There's a great deal of difference in this stuff. There's been about a couple of centuries worth of debate. Did Shakespeare pinch the plot of Hamlet the way he pinched the plot of just about everything else? Specifically, was there a play by Thomas Kyd about a Danish prince called Hamlet with a dead dad and a host of ensuing complications? And suppose I get in my time machine and I go back to 1587 and I abstract from the Admiral's Men a manuscript of Kyd's Hamlet, and I walk into the British Museum in 2025 and I go, bang, case closed. And they go, what's that supposed to be? And I say, that is a manuscript, a copy of Kyd's Hamlet. And they say it's not old enough. Look at it, it's not aged properly. And you say, well, I brought it here by time machine. And then they call the police. Because if it really has been brought by time machine, then it only records the age that is recorded in your machine. It hasn't aged properly. So what do you do? I mean, how would you go about convincing people? So this was part of what drove Conference for Chrononauts, the idea of a gathering of people from different times who brought with them a characteristic artifact or a piece of knowledge or a piece of art in order to demonstrate, look, I've come here from 2073 or 20, And that I hope was one way that an idea from the sort of thing I do kind of fed directly into something Robert.
Yeah, absolutely. These kind of ideas of objects that exist within time and without time. But again, going back to that exhibition, how to then take an object and say this is one of those objects. Yeah, there's I suppose making this this thing, which is is obviously a clock, but it doesn't actually tell the time. It tells time, which then I've been working on this for about 2 years now, and so every time I meet someone in the street and I say I'm working on a clock that tells time, but not time, and that's become a kind of difficult conversation. To have.
So it should be a difficult conversation.
So you're here to have
Well, we were talking about a kind of clock the other day. Lewis Carroll fans in the audience. Any? Yes. Has anybody been brave enough to go beyond the Alice books and have a look at Sylvie and Bruno? Oh, no.
It's awful.
Yes, it is awful, genuinely. Sylvie and Bruno's terrible. It's 99% Victorian baby talk. And that's terrible beyond imagination. But there's a couple of really lovely ideas buried in there for the really dedicated seeker of thought experiments. One of them is a country which is covered by its own map. You see, the map is exactly the same size as the territory depicted, and you think, oh, that would be, oh no, hang on. And it takes you a moment to think, no, that's absolutely no good at all, because you need a map to the map. But the one that Robert and I found interesting, there's a kind of clock called an outlandish watch, which is not the thing hanging in my pocket. An outlandish watch has a slightly different relationship to time. You see, normally the relationship that a watch like this has to time is a descriptive one. This one tries to record the passing seconds. An outlandish watch has a prescriptive relationship to time, you see. In other words, if you think, I fancy it being 10:15, and you set the outlandish watch to 10:15, bingo, it becomes 10:15. And so there's a lot of kind of proto-time travel fun in this one extremely good chapter, and the otherwise waste verbiage that the Sylvie and Bruno concluded, where the characters get to play with a reset button. And talking to people, I think people don't want time travel. This is my theory. People don't want moments laid out that you can visit. They want an outlandish watch. They want a reset button. They want to be able to undo. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be the room for that. The only way we can do that, I think, is to visit alternative arrangements of space and time, which is where artists, of course, it's one thing to set up a thought experiment. It's another to try to imagine the lived consequences, the sort of juxtapositions of knights on penny farthings, which is one of my favourite Robert images. But I'll just say a quick thing about another time travel philosophy problem, which you will find subtly bodied forth in some of this. One of the other things that you can do with the time machine is you can make things cause themselves. Just sticking with the Elizabethan drama motif, suppose I take a copy of the Norton Shakespeare, very good edition, and I get in my time machine and I go back to 1588 and I collar one William Shaxbert, as he was calling himself, horse coper and would-be dramatist. And I say to him, Shaxbert, likest thou the plays? Shaxbert says, verily. And I say, well, try some of this. What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet what to me is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me, no, woman neither. And Shaxbert says, hast any more? And I say, aye, and hand him the Norton. And I say, oh, one thing, Shakespeare will play better than Shaxbert. Trust me. And Shakespeare says, I can't keep up the chord of the 16th century. Shakespeare says, what's the effect? What do you expect me to do with this? And I say, copy it. Sit with your quill and copy away like a mad thing and hand out manuscripts to the Admiral's men and the Lord Stranger's men and the King's men, and makest thou a name for thyself. Thou shalt be Andrew Lloyd Webber, to Robert said. And Shakespeare goes frantic for copies and these plays, and they become part of the canon, and several centuries pass and they get printed until I buy the copy of the Norton and I take it back and the loop closes. That's a hint. You think, well, I haven't changed history, I haven't erased history. There's something very strange about this. Who has written Hamlet? And in this bizarre and extremely counterfactual scenario, which, if you're interested, I stole from a novel by Anthony Burgess, I should confess. Who writes Hamlet? The answer is nobody. Hamlet isn't written, Hamlet just is. And that too seems a bit troubling if you think about it. You don't expect plays to spring into it, to just be their own parents, as it were. But you will find that problem visually bodied forth in various of the images that Robert has put together. So I hope that was an influence.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea of Hamlet existing elsewhere as well. I mean, beyond Thomas Hood, but also, sorry to rewind a little, but to go back to Lewis Carroll and Sylvie and Bruno and the clock. In a way, the map that covers the terrain and the clock, I mean, they actually have quite a lot of similarities, of course, because I mean, the clock is a map of time in a sense, and so making a clock that can rewind and fast forward and pause time, which is a bit like the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, of course, where the Mad Hatter seems to be on, well, he's a good friend of time until the Queen accuses him of murdering time, and so then time falls out with him, and he's stuck there 6 o'clock perpetually, which is why they don't wash any dishes and run around having tea all the time, because it's perpetual tea time. But yes, the map and the terrain, I suppose that's what this is trying to do, or I'm trying to confuse the map and the terrain, the clock and time itself, to try and make some kind of thing that doesn't quite measure, but embodies or kind of articulates this imagining something that had a greater relationship to time than a arbitrary set of numbers.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing that we talk about in my line of work as well, because there are certain things that are captured quite nicely by the sort of serial aspect of time. I mean, if I say the First World War was earlier than the Second World War, it's a fairly straight, fairly unexceptional fact. And that's a fact that's not going to change. It isn't as if World War II used to be before World War I and they got up and swapped one day. I mean, if someone were to ask you, well, when is the First World War earlier than the Second World War, you would look at them slightly askance. Well, it's always the case that the First World War is earlier than the Second. It's always the case that 1914 is earlier than 1939, just as it's always the case that 2025 is earlier than 2030. So there are lots of facts that are quite nicely captured by the map, by the static side of it. But if all there was the static facts, you wouldn't be able to function. This is sorry, I told you this on Tuesday, so fingers and ears for the next 90 seconds. But suppose you come out of the dentist, not my dentist is a wonderful and caring person, but you come out of your hypothetical dentist after a horrific searching, scream and polish at 11:25, and you stagger down the street weeping. And at 11:30, as the pain is beginning to ebb, you think, well, thank goodness that's over. And you're thanking goodness for something, quite a familiar something, but what are you thanking goodness for? You're not thanking goodness for the fact that 11:30 is later than 11:25, are you? Help me out here. You're not surely you're not thanking goodness for the fact that 11:30 is later than 11:25, because 11:30 is always later than 11:25. You can't get on a bus and say to the assembled passengers, I tell you, rejoice, 11:30 is later than 11:25.
Although if you thought about it, we should be grateful.
We should.
Yeah.
I can't get people to, I mean, I've tried, not actually on buses, fortunately, but I have tried. I said, look, isn't it great that 11:30, and people just, nah, and they won't entertain it at all. So presumably you're thanking goodness, and this is back to the dentist's chair example, you're thanking goodness for the fact that something is past. But it being past, it isn't like sort of being over there, that's part of it. You get the sense, well, it's laid out in a sequence of everything else, but something has happened to an event in virtue of being past. This is not a very cheerful example, but I was at a funeral for a friend some years ago, and the celebrant said, well, we like to think that Paul, his name was Paul, he hasn't gone, he's just in another room. And I kind of bit back the thought, like, there's another room, we can go and get it, can't we? He's not, he's in that box in Plymouth, and I'm trying to keep my face, suitably. Hazards of doing the philosophy of time, which are never off duty, even at a funeral. And I thought, well, the past really isn't another room, is it? I mean, I don't have memories of other rooms, and I have memories of the past. And so one of the things that I think is bodied full beautifully in a number, particularly the two matching square images either side, is the serial aspect of time and where you put an order on it and what makes the difference between the different determinations. Where is the past, where is the future? You can put, you can put an arrow on it, you can put a convention on it, but it's not the same as making something past. So the map is part of it, but what's the difference between the map and of time and the thing that it's mapping? When's the flow? When's the dynamism, the spark, if you will? I'd like you all to send me 2,000 words. Because you're nodding away and he's going to ask for an essay in a minute. I'm not, but just something to think about.
We were just talking about shape and shape that people visualize time as a shape, often timeline or a circle. People talk about different cultures having a linear or circular view of time, which actually makes kind of little sense because we do both, I suppose. But I suppose I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the shape of time.
Oh, well, the shape, goodness. Well, if I knew the shape of time,
visually.
Visually.
Kind of visual metaphors of time. Like bit of descriptions of time and spatial metaphors.
Right, a quick disclaimer. I refer you to the quote from St. Augustine that Robert very kindly incorporated into the text materials of this exhibition, that whenever, time is the most familiar thing of all until someone asks me what it is, to describe it. But there's a fascinating tension across a great many different cultures, not just Western cultures, this is far bigger than Western culture, between linear representations of time and cyclical or repetitive versions of time. The idea that the universe is in a sense circular, and it will recur to the same state, and has recurred to the same state again and again and again. Nietzsche took this idea over wholesale from ancient Greek cosmology. Epicurus and others said, well, look, if there's only a finite amount of arrangements that matter, and you have an infinite amount of time to play with, if you wait long enough, it will just come round again and again and again, and it has come round again and again and again and again without end, infinitely. So if you think you've been here before, you have, or something very like you have. And Nietzsche said that if you could accept life in these terms, if you could say yes to the infinite repetition of every misjudgment, every failure, every humiliation, every stubbed toe, every misfired joke, then good for you, and you were well on the way to being uber, in the Nietzschean sense, Nietzschean sense. And I'm not very uber, I confess, the idea of the infinite repetition. But the idea of time as cyclical is embedded in a lot of cultures. And so the idea, as I see it, is that Nietzsche doesn't deny that time seems to have its linear, you're born and then you die, and that's pretty linear. Your death is later than your birth is before your death, but if you wait long enough, the birth comes round again. So which of them really is first? If you wait long enough. And there's a fascinating sort of coda to this that says, well, suppose time isn't just the linear repetition, one thing after another, but suppose the future really is the past, as it swallows itself, like a snake eating its own tail. In which case, the timeline is like a line of latitude. You know, you go far enough east and you find yourself heading back west. So it's not infinite, but it's not linear either. And so in a sense, your birth is as much in the future as it is in the past. And this is where you need visual representations. You need a visual peg to hang the idea of a closed loop or a repetitive loop, or the one embedded in the other. And you can see them behind them and elsewhere around the room.
To say one of my favourite, and yours too, Alasdair, I think, representations of time or the passage of time would be in Tristram Shandy, where Lawrence Sterne maps out the structure of the book that you've just been reading it, with the digressions chapter by chapter. So chapter 1, go along with it, and up and down and down. And I've stolen that several times for a couple of my exhibitions. It's in the newspaper that I've made to go with this exhibition, because it also seems like a perfect description of how one might go around an exhibition like this, full of digressions and pitfalls. Something else about Lawrence Sterne that I talked about in the statement, I was interested, apparently in the Italian introduction to Tristram Shandy, Carlo Levi talks about the sort of infinite digressions in that book as being a kind of commentary on the passage of time towards death and the inevitable, and which makes Tristram Shandy sound like a lot proof-based book than it really is. But the idea of a piece of art that is frantically trying to thicken time as you go through it, to make time slower or less linear, really appeal, because I mean, I feel it's a kind of natural aesthetic to clog up space with details, but it also seems to be, to me, a good representation of time. I mean, if we're making a kind of map or that is as accurate as possible, then as much detail as possible is a better representation of reality, and yet more and more useless as a map, because maps need to be streamlined in order to be read, because you try to make a simplified version of something.
Yes, the map that grows to be the same size as the country it depicts is no
Yeah.
longer a useful map.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also think that kind of trying to reckon with complexity, I suppose, is a pretty vital thing. A lot of the kind of ugliness in our world is through a sort of inability to reckon with complexity. Kind of bigotry and narrow-mindedness, I think, is an inability to kind of approach the mess of the world. But which is why I keep my bedroom in the state that I do.
This is probably going to be my last observation, because, no pun intended, I'm conscious that time is passing. So no, genuinely no pun intended. But one of the things that I mean, we kind of bonded over a sharing of sort of similar ideas and books. And Tristram Shandy, one of the things that's nice about it is that, as Robert says, in outline, all this stuff about infinity might sound very dour. And normally stories about infinity are either unnerving or flat out terrifying. Alice in Wonderland fans who want to be frightened, I send you to Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman, which is infinity without the grin. It's really, really one of the most frightening books I've ever read. It's very funny, but it's also very scary. But Tristram Shandy manages to play around. I mean, there's a lovely bit where he says, well, it's actually taken me 3 days to write the events of the first day of my life. It's getting further and further away. You know, the future's getting further away as I write. And philosophers have been much exercised by this, and they have worked out, I'll spare the proof, but they worked out that if Tristram Shandy wrote infinitely long, he would eventually catch up. He would cover every day, even if it takes 3 days, and then 4 days, and then 5 to cover each day. And so one of the things that I liked with this is that there are some very serious things boded forth here about either the finitude of time or the infinitude of time, but in ways that are light-hearted and colourful. And you know, where's its learning and the considerable amount of thought and depth, likely, and you can lose yourself in these images, and I would encourage you so to do, but in a way that's fun. So I'm extremely grateful to Robert, who's brought a lot of fun and a lot of interest into my life these 6 years, and it's a great honour and a privilege to be able to sit here and talk about his work. And Robert is actually wearing some of his art. Oh, it slipped off.
It slipped off.
It slipped off. He's actually got etched copper art about his person. I urge you to draw closer to Robert.
I need to credit my sister for the construction of this garment, which I've made etched copper plates so I can embody printmaking while I sit here in Edinburgh Printmakers. Thank you, Alasdair.
Right, so shall we proceed to Q&A? If there are questions, I mean, there may not be any.
It was so complete.
It's always slightly presumptuous to say, let's proceed to the question, because hypothetically, if there are questions. Yes?
This might be quite a stupid question, sorry, but I understand that time is quite a tangible thing. Like that's why I would assume what I capture is chaoticness and all the things that happen simultaneously, and they slip out of our hands, and time is wrapped around us, but also consequences. But how also is that, in what your opinion affects humanness, if you didn't cover that?
I suppose that's so enmeshed and embedded in our experience that it becomes an extremely hard thing to. I suppose that's your job, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So
yeah, I mean, obviously time is so closely bound up with our perceptions. We try to imagine a literally timeless experience. You might think that a timeless experience is one that just goes on a long time, but that isn't timelessness. But yet, time is not given to us in the way that a colour or a shape or a texture is. I mean, what colour, shape, or texture has a moment? But yet, it's against that background. So it's as if, I mean, the way that, this is an analogy that I use with my students, but imagine you had a glass vessel, handy glass vessel, and it had exactly the optical properties of air. So there was no refraction or reflection when it's in the air. So you couldn't see it. If it had no liquid in it, it would be invisible. But it still has a shape, it still constrains its content. So once it has contents, you could begin to get a sense of the shape of it. And that's the closest we can get to perceiving time, is we perceive things taking more or less. And of course, that's very unreliable. Mood, tiredness, heat, cold can all affect that. And we get a measure of agreement with other people. We tend to get a measure of agreement about the order of events more easily than we do about how fast things take. An experience that you're enjoying flies by, an experience that you're not enjoying drags, and that's a perfectly familiar fact. But to the best of my knowledge, there's nobody equipped with an aberrant sense of time order. There's nobody going through life with their memory tracking what I regard as the future and anticipating what I regard as the past. So at least there's that much of a shared framework. But the divergences are really very, very, and there are, of course, kind of certain pathologies, which takes us into the philosophy of time. People whose time sense is sometimes damaged, that they have a subjective dragging and a subjective speeding up. and trying to get a coordinate that you can all agree on. You know, how long does this process take for you? Well, that's for you. How do you compare it with someone else? How do you take someone else's experience and, as it were, hold it up to the line next to yours? And these are all things that are, I mean, I don't have any answers to these questions. Clearly, I don't have any answers, but they're good questions.
There's, is it Boethius that imagines God sitting in a kind of eternal core with time happening all around it?
Yeah.
And so imagining being in that kind of center where, like, an eternity is happening all the time, all at once, is you know, something for the brain to process.
Yeah, Augustine had that conception as well. Augustine was much exercised by the question, if God knows what we're going to do in the future, can we be free? I mean, if God knows what we're going to have for our dinner tomorrow, is there a sense in which I've got any say in the matter? And Augustine said, well, don't think that God sees the future the way you do. God sees the future from outside. You know, God sees events. So it isn't that God's knowledge dictates what you're going to do, it's that what you're going to do dictates God's knowledge. But it's all right, it's not for knowledge, because it's like looking at that circular arrangement from outside. You can see what everything is relative to everything else, but you're not inside the picture.
There's a story by Jorge Luis Borges about a person who discovers a point in his basement where they can see the entirety of time and space all at once. Just caught my cow. And yeah, he can't stop looking at it. But I suppose that's basically what we're trying to do here in this room, make those kind of points in space where the whole of time and space can be seen.
I was going to bring up that story. It's called the Aleph. The Aleph is the point at which, and another Borges story that I like, it's called Funé the Memorious, but a man called Ireneo Funé, who, as a result of a head injury, is given perfect recall. So it takes him 6 months to remember 6 months of his life. So he just lies in his bed, replaying his life. And he doesn't do anything else, to the point where he doesn't exercise or eat. And I think part of the model of that is maybe the failure of memory and the fluctuating of perception is a merciful thing. I hope you're not sorry you asked the question. Are there any more? Yes.
So Sarah says, Robert, your work took my breath away when I came to the room to see the exhibition. It's incredible, thank you for creating it. Has your view on time become more and more circular and or multidimensional since making the work?
Oh, since making the work, well, that's 2 weeks ago, I think. But yes, yes, definitely much more multi-dimensional. I'm not sure about circular in the sense that I suppose thinking about time now, it gets quite eschatological, I suppose, with I fear that civilization is kind of grinding to some kind of cataclysm, and thinking about time in that way, you know, on a small scale, time is quite circular. We expect 1 year to be like another year, and so it's not the kind of grand circles that we're talking about with the whole kind of history repeating itself a la Nietzsche, but you know, 1 week Tuesday, I know I'm supposed to do, get up at this time and go to this place every Tuesday, and so on and so forth. And through aeons, human beings as kind of people that react to nature and who, hunt, gather or farm, have responded to things, to markers in the natural world that make the measurement of time, the seasons, and that kind of flow. Now we can go into a supermarket and we can get any kind of produce that comes from any kind of season at any time of year. It's that kind of measurement of time or experience of time as something kind of vital and novel is out of joint. And I suppose the amount of kind of world-ending potentials seem to increase every day. And during this exhibition, the construction of this exhibition, they seem to get busier and busier and thicker. And I was saying to someone yesterday that I kept thinking in the last couple of months, well, if I can get this exhibition done before the world ends, that'll be okay. And so I did. So it's okay now. Everything can carry on. Is that an answer?
I should perhaps briefly revert to the John Menzies 1976 Doctor Who Paint a Monster competition. It's true, I was a winner. I was a runner-up because they had an unlimited number of entries, and I just covered page upon page upon page upon page, and I won 6 fluorescent crayons. And I thought that this was a mark of distinction, and I Googled it specifically for this talk because I thought there were maybe half a dozen of us. There were 1,500 runners-up, so we are legion. I've never met another one, but there must be, obviously time will have taken some of them out and the interview but there could be something like 1,400 other poor souls kicking themselves that they didn't.
So not fluorescent crayons.
Fluorescent crayons, which we probably ate. Yeah. Any more by way of questions? Sorry, I saw a hand. Yes.
I had a very bad time trying to write a book for children about time, and it involved talking to a lot of 5 and 6-year-olds. And I discovered that they got very, very upset at the idea that it was possible to control time, to measure time in more than, you could have 12 hours, you could have 24 hours. Equally, you could have 7.5 hours in a day. Do you think that human beings need that construct to keep feeling safe? Because I had one child who actually had a nightmare because he felt that I had upset. He felt that his day had gone through in some way because he realised that you didn't have 60 minutes in an hour and 24 hours in a day. So I was wondering whether at what point is time measurement actually essential for the human being to keep us feeling safe?
But it's quite a recent phenomenon, isn't it? The division of time into
sunrise to sunset.
Yeah, but trying to imagine being. Yeah, no, it makes me feel quite. I need to sit down and look at a clock and think.
I'm maybe too far the other way. I find that if I have a memory that I can't put in the right place in the time sequence, this is a great subject of anxiety to me. This is not entirely sure I should be saying this in a public gathering, but I need to have a very rigidly determined sense of time, and I bore relatives with my ability to place events within a couple of days And I go, oh, that's great, Alasdair, well done. Yes, thank you for doing. And but I'm sorry that your child interviewee finds. So was the fear realizing that hours are something that we kind of sort of paint on time and they don't actually correspond to something? Yeah, because I remember going through something not dissimilar, because I thought, I'm not counting this right. Because I tried, Johnny Ball has a lot to answer for, but I saw Johnny Ball talking about time dilation. You know, the idea that if you're traveling very fast, that time passes at a different rate from your surroundings. So I sat in my parents' rocking chair with a watch and a clock, and I started rocking back and forth on the desk, trying to slow my rate of passage into the future. And I thought, wait a minute, how do I know which is right? Which is the right second? Who's got the right second? And it didn't give me nightmares, but I think I have an inkling of what your child went through.
It's interesting getting a child's perspective, like building a perspective of time in a child as well. Last year, my child, if you tried to talk about things that happened long ago, it would be, in class in one zone. So you talk about the Big Bang, you talk about like the dinosaurs, the ancient Romans, the ancient Egyptian, civilizations, and the birth of matter. And it was like, that's when I was a baby. Yeah. There's no concept of before you yourself, and everything was kind of in that kind of squishy time where you still existed, but you weren't aware of it. Is there any more questions?
Thank you, John and Alasdair. I'm also a researcher in philosophy of time, and part of my work is thinking about how time is embodied and thinking about how our time sense is in part determined by our human connections. And I think, and I have thought for a while, that there's a set of components of that, and I would be curious what both of you think about the role of art is in our sense of time, how it could ground us or connect us to some semblance of passage of time.
Art can function a bit as I suppose, a way of time travel itself. You can read the works of Shakespeare, say, and you are transported to another time and place.
Because one thing that we talked about was that there are medieval religious paintings that have the convention that you can trace a life from the background to the foreground of the picture. There are depictions of the life of Christ where the crucifixion can be seen on a hill to the right of the picture, and to the left of the picture there's the nativity, and different incidents will be foregrounded in the front of the picture. And so that seems to be taking the spatialization of time in a way that strikes us as very literal, but presumably it wasn't literal for the person depicting it. Here is a handy analogy. But time and embodiment, how far we would have a sense of time if we didn't have sort of circadian rhythms, let's say. Would we have a sense of time? Would we have a sense of duration? How do you know your sense of duration matches up? And to some extent, we just have to take that on trust. We just have to take on trust the idea that as long as we agree on the same basic facts, like time order, as I say, provided people agree on time order, we can let duration, to some extent, be more subjective. But there are depictions in art that seem very friendly to sort of spatial or sort of serial versions. I am conscious that we are getting, I don't want to say running out of time for being all stampede out of the, when I say running out of time, I mean in the sense of coming to the end of this talk. Well, thank you all.
Thank you very much.